She wipes her cheeks of phantom tears. What's on tonight? It's trauma and fear. Gaze into the black mirror with eyes to see. Could it be clearer? Oh, oh, we hold these truths, you know. Oh, we've got the proof. Oh, you know the thing. Pour yourself some discernment, my friend. Distractions and traumas. One begins before the other ends. Say no, reject the lies. The truth is imperative. That's why we're reframing the narrative.
Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Reframing the Narrative. And we are so thrilled to have Brady joining us for part 2 of the discussion that we started about a month or so ago about suppressed tech and kind of the motivations behind that. Now, we talked a lot to Brady about his background and how he got to this point, but we never really did a deep dive into one of his big passion projects, which is researching this suppressed tech and trying to dig under why is this going on, who's doing it. And so without further ado, Brady, really great to see you again, brother, and just welcome back to the show, and thank you in advance for all the work that you've done. I'll just hand the mic over to you, but before I do that, what's been going on in your part of the island nation? What's been developing since we talked last?
Yeah, what's new? Well, I've been settled down and back to business in Hawaii and just doing my farmers markets and taking care of my farm. It seems like when you leave here for a month, you come back and you have 3 months to catch up on it. So I'm getting back to baseline, but it's beautiful today, and I've been getting out and trying to do as much work on the farm as I can when the weather's good. So yeah, today's focus is the suppression of technology, and I put together a little presentation. So, tech suppression. I got a couple quotes to start off. Buckminster Fuller said, "There isn't any energy crisis, it's simply a crisis of ignorance." And Max Planck, who was kind of one of the pioneers of quantum physics, most people quote it as science advances one funeral at a time, which is basically what he's saying, but that's his actual quote. So there's three main subjects that there's other things that are certainly suppressed. Anything that competes with other commercial interests is potentially a subject for suppression, but most of it has to do with free energy devices, or over unity energy is what you often hear it referred to as, because over unity means that you get more out than you put in, which basically, the scientific community will always come back to, oh, perpetual motion devices don't exist. It breaks the second law of thermodynamics, or whatever it is. So laws are made to be broken, and plenty of people have found ways around what we supposedly believe are laws. So there's energy, there's medical. I'm not really going to focus on that today, even though that's a big part of my interest. I'm kind of focusing more on the energy stuff today. And the third one is gravity and time manipulation, which is basically, uh, well, it's complicated, but that's some really like heavy, deep physics that is completely swallowed up by the defense industry. So basically, here we go. Cheap energy. Who's hiding the cheap energy from us? Who's keeping it from us? Obviously, it's the energy producers that we buy all our energy from. Who's keeping the cures from us? The people who sell us medicine. And who's keeping other kinds of crazy futuristic technology from us? Sci-fi tech, I guess you would say. The defense industry uses it all for weaponization. So basically, everything's controlled by the elites, the bankers. So I'll read off what I said here. Cabal of international banking families control not only the boards of major corporations, but also universities, scientific societies, media conglomerates, and agents in every government office that they use to run cover, including all of the spies and all of the military and all of the police. So they're all underneath the umbrella of our controllers. Now, how do they suppress things? There's a lot of ways. When it comes to science, the first thing is a lot of guys used to just, they invent something, they go to the patent office, they try to get a patent so they're protected and they can make money off of it. Well, the patent office has some ways of bearing. First of all, they can just say, oh, it's not going to work, we're not going to approve this patent. And then they also have the Invention Secrecy Act, which I think was 1951, which basically came after World War II. And they said, there's just all these scientific advancements that could be weaponized and used against us. And so we have to keep them in the weapons industry and control that. There's the peer review process, which is the way that, the academics, the control of academia is basically done by, grants are awarded by major corporations and places like that, that have an interest in getting a certain result. And then the peer review process is used to censor people who they don't agree with or who have a radical idea. The professional organizations, for example, the American Medical Association with the pharmaceuticals, the Bar Association for lawyers, anything like that. ACS is the American Cancer Society. They've kept a lot of cancer cures hidden. So you've got, of course, government is controlled by lobbying and campaign contributions. And then anything, like I said, that can be considered national security, anything that can be weaponized is completely censored and shut off. And so, if all those things can't work to keep you suppressed, they will eventually go as far as destroying your creation and murdering you and your family if they have to. So I just threw this in here because I found it interesting. This is a picture from the church committee with the CIA saying, "Oh, we have this heart attack gun. It's a modified Colt, which fires a dart of frozen shellfish toxin, which then thaws once it gets in your body. It leaves hardly a mark, like a mosquito bite mark, and it goes into your bloodstream and it kills you almost instantly." But then this big quote on the top here is a quote from Tom Bearden, who's a guy who's written a lot about free energy and 0 point energy. And he's talking about the electromagnetic beam shooter, which is an electromagnetic heart attack gun. Usually when you hear a reference to the heart attack gun, people are talking about the church committee shellfish toxin dart, but there is also electromagnetic ways to cause a person's heart to just totally go into fibrillation and kill them in minutes. A lot of these people die of heart attacks, and there's no proof. There's no way to prove whether it was natural or not. So I'm going to focus on energy production mostly today. A lot of it is actually automobile engine technologies. And then if we have time at the end, I wanted to talk a little bit about cold fusion, which has been rebranded as low energy nuclear reactions. But I'm going to start off with some of the old school guys. John Keeley was a guy from the 19th century. In the mid 1800s, he basically created a motor that he demonstrated in 1872. It works like a water hammer. So if anybody's familiar with, if you shut off, or if you have your water line shut off and you turn it on real quick, it'll kind of go conk, 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 and it creates this like water hammer effect. And so that's how John Keeley's motor would start, and then it would resonate. Most people never figured out how it works, and he's called by many people as a fraudster because nobody could make his motor work. But there is this guy named Dale Pond that has gone back and worked with his motor and preserved a lot of his legacy. So the superstar of the presentation is Nikola Tesla. He's the guy who created the AC power that we use today, the 60 hertz AC power. He basically created all the basics of radio transmission that Marconi got credit for. He's the first guy that created remote control. He gave a demonstration like at Madison Square Garden or somewhere in New York where he had a big pool of water and he had a remote control boat, and people would like call out commands and he would make it do what they said or whatever. And so that was pretty amazing at the time, which is what is basically evolved into the drone tech that we use to go and kill people in other countries without risking our soldiers. So this is a picture of his magnifying transmitter that he built in Wardenclyffe, New York, and on Long Island. It never was completed because he was relying on funding that he was getting from J.P. Morgan. And once J.P. Morgan realized that he was trying to give free power to the world, Morgan said, I can't put a meter on this, and he quit giving him money. So he never was able to finish it and ended up, that was like his life's work that he never got to finish. He did, there's rumors that, and I mean, not rumors, his nephew says that he rode around in the car that Tesla retrofitted with a engine that basically was running on some vacuum tubes and radiant energy, supposedly, which is etheric energy. So he did a lot of amazing things in his lifetime, and you could just talk for hours just about this guy. But anyway, in 1937 in New York, he was hit by a taxi. There's no like proof that that was intentional or accidental. But he just went home and he didn't even go to the hospital. He just went back to his hotel room and walked it off. And then when he died, a lot of people are aware these days with Trump in office that his uncle, Donald Trump's uncle, John George Trump, he was an MIT professor in the what was it called? The high voltage electronics department or something. Anyway, so when Tesla died, um, his papers were all collected by the FBI a couple days after he died, but his nephew was one of the first people. This is also his heir to all of whatever he owned when he died was going to his nephew. His nephew showed up that morning after he had been found dead in his room, and he said that the room had already been rifled through and a bunch of his notes were missing, like all of his stuff about his death ray that he was talking to the government about, developing into a super weapon. So anyway, Tesla, everybody's pretty much heard about this guy. They know about him. T. Henry Moray was a guy who in the 20s, he created a radiant energy device. He was a big fan of Tesla's. He was contemporary with Tesla, but he was a bit younger. And his device was based off of, he found a certain mineral when he was in Sweden. He called it the Swedish stone that he brought back with him to America, and he used it to create his device. And apparently it was germanium, and then he doped it with some radioactive material, uranium, I think, and maybe something else, maybe thorium or something. I forget. But anyway, he had demonstrated his device multiple times. People said, oh, you're getting induction from the overhead power lines. And so he went out in the middle of the desert, miles away from any power lines or any power source, and he did the same demonstration. He did use a ground rod and he used an antenna. So he was using the voltage between the ground and the ionosphere to be able to create energy. But there was more to it than that, obviously. He was a victim of a lot of sabotage. So the Rural Electrification Agency, which was one of the the Works Progress Administration, the Depression era agencies that was set up to create work for people. They were working with him. A lot of their agents were communists, and they were trying to get him to give his technology to Russia, and he wouldn't give it to Russia. So one guy that was working with him, Fraser, ended up just grabbing a hammer and smashing his device in his lab one day. He had shootouts defending his lab he had Felix Fraser and a couple other guys that broke into his lab, and he got shot in the leg one time defending himself, but he also shot them and chased them out of his lab. He was threatened by the government, and now that he's gone and he only ever had one patent that was accepted, all the rest of his patents are disappeared, but they have been preserved. A lot of them have been preserved, even though the patent office lost them somehow. Another guy that I really like is Victor Schauberger. This guy was an Austrian. His whole thing was uh, comprehend and copy nature, was what he used to say. And he just spent a lot of time out in the woods. He was basically a game warden, and he did a lot of fishing and hunting, and he just spent time in nature. And he realized that the uh, the implosive force of nature, which is centripetal, the vortex going inward, is generative, and the explosive or centrifugal force is destructive, right? And so we focus most of our technology on the destructive explosive force. That's what our combustion engines are. That's what our rockets are, right? And he's saying, look, we're doing it all wrong. We can actually generate energy. We just have to use the opposite force of what we're using. And so he had a lot of work based on vortex energy. And he was kind of tricked into, he came to America as an old man. He was old and sick. And this American organization that had been set up by this guy, Robert Donner, who was a millionaire at the time from steel. He basically got him to sign some contracts in English. The guy didn't even speak English. He didn't like being in America. He wanted to go back home. When he came, he was only here for 3 months, because he had made that a stipulation of coming to the meeting. But he was there for 3 months in Texas, I think, maybe Colorado and Texas. And he ended up signing this contract to give all this technology to this American guy, which basically it pretty much disappeared after that. And he went back home and he died 5 days later in Austria because he knew he had been swindled. Here's another interesting guy. This Canadian inventor, Cove, he invented solar panels, basically. I don't think anybody before him is shown to have created a solar panel, and it wasn't for another 40 or 50 years that Bell Labs first put out, photovoltaic panels. But he had created them as early as 1909. This guy, he got kidnapped, and they offered him $25,000 and a furnished house to give up his patent and shut down his company. He refused. They let him go. So I forget exactly how that went down, how he got out of that. But anyway, later he went to jail for a year for stock fraud because somebody had basically set him up by setting up a company for him and then doing some shady stuff, and then he ended up going down for it. And then he disappeared twice more after he got out of a year in jail. And the last time he disappeared was 1921, never to be seen again. Lester Hendershot, this is a guy that our friend Agent did an article about on Substack, and this guy's fascinating. He was not he was an intelligent guy, but he wasn't really an engineer by trade, I don't think. He basically was just a tinkerer, and he made this little engine for his kid's model airplane that didn't require any fuel, and it was basically an electromagnetic engine that was operating based on the Earth's geomagnetic field, and so when he made it in this little toy airplane, then he was trying to scale it up and make it into something that could be used to power, a full-size airplane or other vehicles of other types. But anyway, he had this accident about a year after he introduced his fuelless motor, and became very praised in the newspapers and stuff. He had an accident in his lab where he was severely electrocuted. He nearly died. I think he recovered from that because he lived for much longer, many years after that. But his son claims that he was bought off for $25,000. He moved to Mexico. I mean, $25,000 at that time was a lot more than what it is now. But he moved to Mexico and he never spoke about his invention again. And then he supposedly died of suicide because he was getting old and he was getting ready to break silence and tell people about his invention. and then he mysteriously just died. You know, he committed suicide. I'm gonna go one or two more of these, and then I'll let you guys jump in and talk. So John Searle in the 40s and 50s, he produced the Searle effect generator. This thing is it's a magnetic motor. It's got rollers around a central big roller, which he calls the plate, but it's basically made up of a three layers. Each the rollers and the middle plate are all made up of like a magnet on the inside, a dielectric, and then a electric conductor surface on the outside. So it's kind of like a capacitor, basically. It's a capacitor design. And you've got little capacitors that rotate around the larger capacitor. And so these things, when it was fired up and had a charge, the rollers actually would not even touch the plate. They would just roll on the magnetic field, uh, completely frictionless around this thing. And then he hooked up external coils around it to create energy inductively, create induction from the magnetism coming off of this motor, and he would create energy from that. He was threatened. His lab was raided. This is the same story you're going to hear over and over again. His lab was raided, everything was confiscated or destroyed, and he was jailed for running an unlicensed energy business. Floyd Sparky Sweet was a guy who graduated with a master's in electrical engineering from MIT, and he worked for GE, General Electric, and for NASA. I mean, he worked for GE most of his career, but there's some connection with NASA in there somehow. He invented a generator which was based off of magnets again. It has to do with the way that his coils and his magnets are set up and how they interact with each other, that it created energy. And a guy, John Bedini, who had worked with him, gave his secret was basically that he was taking these, I think they were neodymium magnets, but he had these huge magnets on top and bottom of his coils. And he would heat them up in a toaster oven. He would put them in the oven, heat them up to get them to a point where he could manipulate the magnetic field of the magnets. And then somehow he would do something to the magnets once he heated them up he called it conditioning the magnets. So he's heating them up to make their magnetic field pliable, and then somehow he manipulates it so that it freezes back as a modified magnetic field. And that was kind of the secret to how his tech worked, but nobody really knows exactly what he did with the magnets to make that happen and hasn't been able to duplicate it. So he was threatened, he was shot at, his lab was burglarized, his notes were stolen. Then finally, he's an old guy. He lived, 1912 to 1995. So he lived, 83 years? He lived to a ripe old age, but he did have a lot of harassment. And then finally, two men showed up at his house. His wife was there. After they left, he ended up dying from a heart attack, like almost immediately. And so obviously his wife knew that these men had something to do with it. The same guys came back the next day and confiscated all of his equipment. So here's a guy, more recent guy from UC Berkeley, that was doing experiments of wrapping quartz crystals with copper coils and electrifying the coils to see how it affected the crystals. One night when he was experimenting, he said that the crystal began to glow and ring, and he measured an output of energy off of the crystal that was more than the energy he was putting in. Immediately, like the next morning, his house was raided. I don't know how they knew what he was doing, who was watching him. Somebody must have been paying attention to him and knew what he had done, and they raided him immediately and confiscated his equipment. And then he was found dead a few years later, out in the desert, just like mysterious, you know. This is a guy he's Bulgarian, Stefan Marinov. He was a physicist, a trained physicist, and he had a lot of beliefs that didn't match up with the established scientific dogma. He's most well known for his magvid. From the people who do know of him, that's what they know him for. It's called magnetic vortex ionization device, magvid. And So this was kind of like a UFO type thing, but basically he was creating energy with it, but he was also having weird time dilation and levitation effects. Um, Ended up dying in 1997 by supposedly jumping out of a window to the street. You know, we've all heard these kind of stories. He was still alive on the street. There was one professor that saw him there, found him there after he had come fallen out of the window or whatever. He was still alive. He called the ambulance and he died in the ambulance. So who knows if there was foul play there. Obviously, falling 4 stories is enough to kill you. So I don't know that that's the weird part. But the weird part is that the guy where he hit the street, when they took his body away, there was a glowing spot in the concrete, on the concrete for 3 days, that glowed for 3 days after his body was removed. So I don't know what that's all about, but that's the story that they tell about this guy. Okay. Did you guys have anything to comment about any of? I know that was a lot that I just threw at you.
Well, yeah, first of all, thank you for all that research. It's awesome. I know that it took a lot of your time to dig into the details because this stuff isn't going to be found on USA Today or the New York Times, right? They're not going to tell you about any of this. So you have to go dig in deep corners. So it's just as Agent has done with his suppressed tech series and all the inventors that he's chronicled who had really interesting technology that leveraged the fundamental free energy available in our realm, uh, and somehow, you know, their tech was, much as you described, either suppressed in some way, destroyed, their lives were ruined, they were mysteriously unalived, all those things. But, you know, as you were going through that first set of slides, the thought occurred to me that although all these inventions that you've detailed are interesting and could be game changers for our quote unquote modern society, I, I can't help but think that perhaps all this is really not necessary. They feel like crude band-aids or popsicle sticks and glue, whereas I believe that if that knowledge had been passed from the old world to our current before whatever reset happened, I actually believe that things were much simpler to control and the energy much more abundant and able to be harnessed. And look no further than the way a lot of buildings were built. I think that they were tapping into the ether. So to me, I look at all those inventions together and I go, cool. But I think that there's a way for all this to be much simpler. But I think it's just a testament to how abundant free energy truly is. And I have more thoughts on that, but that was just my initial reaction to those slides. And before I get long-winded, Jake, you've been sitting there patiently this whole time, so I'm going to pass the mic to you for some additional comments.
Is this thing on? Well, I liked what you were leading into, PJ, because I think for me, it might lead to the question of maybe these individuals were all trying to crack a nut that if it was just, it's not really the like you were saying, kind of maybe rinky-dink tech in a sense, but if they got to the core principle behind all this and everyone had that light bulb moment, no pun intended, because we're talking about inventions, but basically understood that we are in an electromagnetic system and ether is a big part of that, and somehow we can leverage that or tap into it, then that's all that matters. So we just can't cross that barrier there. So really good points there, and maybe Brady can comment on that. But I just had a question about, were all these people self-funded? Because you did get into how the control works, and one big part of that is just the funding. You know, you only get funded if you're serving an agenda of some sort, and then you only get colleagues if you're funded, and so on and so forth. So were all these people like basically tinkering in their garages, or did any of them make some kind of headway in funding and then suddenly disappeared or something?
A lot of these people did have benefactors that allowed them to to be able to do their work. Like I said, even Tesla, he was originally working for George Westinghouse. That's who he sold his original AC patents to. Westinghouse was the one. It's usually depicted as Edison versus Tesla was the DC versus AC, right? Battle. And the problem with DC was you couldn't really transport it that far. And so you would have to have power stations in every neighborhood. And anyway, it just wasn't practical. But anyway, Westinghouse was the one who Tesla was working for originally when he put out all of his AC motors and his AC when they first wired Niagara Falls with AC power and everything, or Buffalo, New York from Niagara Falls. Anyway, that's kind of off topic, but so he was funded by Westinghouse. He ended up, like I said, getting a bunch of money from J.P. Morgan before Morgan realized exactly what he was investing in, and then he also got a lot of money from John Jacob Astor. He was from one of the wealthy opium running families, pirates that founded America. He, for some reason, was really interested in like new technology. And so, yeah, a lot of these guys did have benefactors. The corporations, the elites, the Committee of 300 or whoever, the bankers around the world, they're not really a monolith. There's always competing factions. And so even if overall maybe the oil companies don't want alternative energy, one oil company may invest in alternative energy because it'd give them an edge over their competitor. And then if they find out, oh, this is going to destroy our business instead of giving us a leg up, then they're just going to cut it. um, and as far as what you guys were saying, I do think a lot of this technology is old. Like I think that humans were once a much wiser species. I think that we're in a paradigm of all these machines that we've been given, these combustion engines, and we have a hard time thinking outside of our fish tank, right? Because that's what we live in. But I think that people before we had all these machines understood a lot more about how to manipulate natural energies and how to work with nature to meet all of our needs, right? I mean, they didn't build the pyramids just by slave labor. They had advanced technology. Like a lot of the old buildings, like you were saying, PJ, the buildings that you see, these old spires on the old buildings, they're obviously antennas. They're obviously tapping into the ionosphere or whatever they're doing. And and it's sold to us as, oh, these are just old buildings. Like, never mind, tear it down. We're going to build a new one. But yeah, so I think a lot of this is old stuff that we've rediscovered. And it takes people thinking outside of the box to be able to put their finger on, like, how to access these things. I mean, the electromagnetic theory was put out by James Clerk Maxwell in around the time of the American Civil War, 1860s, is when he published his electromagnetic theory that tied together uh, electricity and magnetism, and showed that light is a form of electromagnetism. People thought of them as separate phenomenon, like the sparks that you can create with this electrostatic generator, like a what am I trying to think of? Like a Leyden jar or something, an old capacitor like Faraday would have been using. They didn't think of light coming through your window as the same phenomenon as these sparks on this capacitor. But Maxwell kind of brought it all together. And anyway, so it kind of starts there, and we start building all this technology, and then it's like all the elements were there at that point for us to figure out ways to create energy in a much more effective way and a much more efficient way. But it was gone about in a certain way that can be patented and can be, protected and monopolized, basically, cartelized. So anyway, so the next part of my presentation is about automobile technology, and some of the guys who are involved in that. And there's a lot of guys. A big part of the
Hey, Brady,
Yeah, go ahead.
if I may, the
Yeah.
other point I wanted to get out there, and I know we're not on exactly the same page when it comes to our realm, but I will say that there have been some intriguing presentations that I've seen recently, and I'm just trying to remind myself really quickly of this guy's name that I ran into. This was actually in an agent's chat that someone had posted. It
Hmm.
was actually a follow-on video by this guy named Phil Godlewski.
I kind of
And he had
haven't
done
been
this really,
keeping up with all of it. I haven't been keeping up much with what's been posted on there, but tell me what it is. Yeah.
yeah. So, and I thought it was a really interesting presentation, as I had said, and this was in the resources chat that is part of Agent's whole thing. But this guy had done a presentation of, okay, not only do we live in this more or less level realm, but there's actually 4 quadrants, and he did this whole presentation about how mankind has lived in these different quadrants, and he links it back to the book of Enoch, how the book of Enoch describes these quadrants.
Hmm.
And then he also talks about how there's in the center of the 4 quadrants, so we're essentially in one of the quadrants, but in the center there's this great vortex, and he kind of comes up with this illustration of sort of a coil, some sort of big
Hmm.
electromagnetic coil that's making everything in our realm kind of operate, including the motion of the actual North Pole, so the
Hmm.
magnetic North Pole, not the geographic North Pole, and how that's been moving. And he ties that also to the prog clock, and how before they messed with the prog clock, how that actually showed that we were in this quadrant and it was moving, and it was
Mm.
showing basically that's what the part of what the prog clock was trying to communicate, that we're in this moving
Uh-huh.
realm and these different quadrants. And so I think that links back to the overall discussion of free energy, but then also too, when you're talking about pyramids, I thought of that because you think about all the different pyramids that have been suppressed, and look no further
Hmm.
than close to where I grew up in the middle of the country in St. Louis, Missouri,
Yeah.
just across the river. There are the Cahokia Mounds, which they call them mounds, but anyone who digs into that will find the truth of the matter was they started excavating, and then it uncovered that these were pyramids, and a lot of them, and they
Hmm.
quickly covered them over, and then kind of, let's not talk about this anymore, right? And the reality is there's far more pyramids in North America and South America than there are in Egypt, and it dwarfs it by, you know,
Yeah.
exponential levels. There's so many pyramids, but it goes against this narrative of the world that we're told we live in. And then if
Yeah.
you kind of extrapolate that to likely in the other quadrants, as the sun and moon and the electromagnetic North Pole have moved around and people have migrated to different parts of the realm, it's very likely in
Hmm.
those other lands there's the same type of technology. And it's just something,
Yeah.
as we take a step back, like, 10,000 foot view, it's very likely that this technology on so many levels is all over the place. I'll wrap it up there, but as you were describing both the tech and the pyramids, I was like, yeah, that picture is so much bigger than people realize.
They are. I mean, we already know that they exist on every continent. And archaeology is just like physics or anything else. I mean, people have their whole lives, their careers invested in a certain paradigm, and they're not willing to give it up just because somebody comes along and says, "Oh, look, we found pyramids in East St. Louis. We found pyramids in Illinois or whatever." And they're going to be like, "No, no, no, you didn't. You're a fraud." Because it just threatens their career. It just means that everything they've done for 30, 40 years is just wrong. And people aren't willing, it's just like that Max Planck quote about how science advances one funeral at a time, because it's not the new idea comes along and everybody just adopts it. It's like it challenges too many old ideas, and you have to wait for those people that hold all those old ideas to die off before the young people can say, okay, we've got a better model of things now or whatever, right? So yeah, that's true.
Just scan the QR code.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay, I'm gonna go back to the
Sorry for that
presentation.
interruption. Yeah, keep going here.
No, no worries. So a lot of the automotive stuff has to do with well, I'll get to it, but electrolysis is a way to break down the water molecule into its constituent hydrogen and oxygen. And it's basically just shocking the water molecule into disintegrating into its constituent elements, and then you can use that hydrogen as fuel. And it doesn't create any waste products. It just ends up um, turning back into water when it condenses. So it's a completely clean energy. But we'll start with Rudolf Diesel. People know about diesel engines, of course, but I don't know if everybody knows who created the diesel engine. Rudolf Diesel created the diesel engine in 1893, over 100 years ago, and he created it to run on vegetable oil. He ran the engine completely on peanut oil. No, there was no petroleum products used. In 1913, he was on a steamship to London and he disappeared. He never ended up, he wasn't on the boat when they got to London, or, whatever. He never disembarked from the boat in London, I guess we should say. Not alive anyway. Um, and then since then, diesel engines have stuck around, but they're only run on diesel fuel. They don't run them on oil. And you do find a lot of people these days that do biodiesel. Well, the original diesel was biodiesel. But anyway, it was changed over to be run on petroleum, and it was designed to be run on vegetable oil. A lot of the automotive improvements were based on the carburetor design. So Charles Pogue was one of the first. He created a carburetor design that allowed him to run his car 200 miles on 1 gallon of gas. In 1936, it caused a little bit of a panic in the oil market. People thought oil was going to become worthless when they found out about this Pogue carburetor. It made that much of an impact on people. I mean, not everybody was even driving cars in the 30s, but this was a pretty game-changing technology. So they started putting lead in the gas, and it's not clear if they did it because of him, but his carburetors didn't work with the leaded gas, and so it obsoleted his invention. He did have his lab broken into and prototypes stolen. He was threatened. He had the usual stuff. And then in an interview, like 20 years later in the 50s, the guy was asking him, the interviewer was asking him, do you want to share your story about your invention? And he did the interview, but his quote in the interview was said, "I have nothing to gain by telling my story. If I knew I were to die tomorrow, or if I were leaving the country, I would tell it. And it is quite a story." But he basically said, like, I can't tell you, man, because they're going to kill me if I say anything. So, so that was what happened to him. I'm not sure about how he died. I think he died of natural causes, but that's because he didn't tell his story. This guy, Tom Ogle, was in the 70s. He's another carburetor design. Basically, what was the story? He somehow accidentally put a hole in the, I don't know. Anyway, basically what he was doing is running the fuel system on vapor. The fuel system runs most efficiently on vapor. So he was basically taking the output from the engine and running it back into the engine and omitting the fuel pump and the carburetor somehow. I don't know. I'm not a mechanic really, but anyway, he supposedly achieved 100 miles a gallon. He installed this carburetor on his 1972 Thunderbird. He sold rights to his invention, but the securities law was supposedly violated, and so I don't know exactly what happened with that, but it wasn't ever really put into production, obviously. This guy had some crazy stuff happen to him. He apparently liked to hang out in the bars and gamble and stuff. He was in the Southwest somewhere. I forget if he was in Utah or Nevada somewhere. Anyway, 1980, he was shot in the stomach at a bar. I don't know why, he just was shot. Maybe somebody was trying to kill him because of his carburetor. And then later, he signed over 22% of his royalties for that he had made by selling the rights to his invention for a debt from shooting pool. Apparently, he owed somebody money from shooting pool, and they threatened him to signing over 22% of his royalties under duress. Then he died a few years later after coming home from a bar. He came to a friend's house to sleep after they had left the bar, and he died at that guy's house that night. And they found like a large overdose of tranquilizers in his system, which he probably, obviously he didn't do that to himself. Somebody did that to him. But so that's what happened to him. Now this one's pretty crazy. Rory Johnson. I don't know exactly what this motor's all about. I haven't tried to figure it out, but he invented a motor called the magnetron, and it's said to be a cold fusion laser activated magnetic motor. I'm not sure what the what the mechanism is really. It seems like kind of a word salad a little bit, but anyway, it supposedly produced 525 horsepower and would fuel a large vehicle for 100,000 miles on fuel of about 2 pounds of deuterium and gallium. So deuterium is heavy water. It's hydrogen with an extra proton. It's used a lot in fusion experiments. And then gallium is a byproduct of bauxite, which they use to make aluminum. So these are pretty readily available. They're not like super rare elements or anything. But anyway, Greyhound, there was a guy who was a mechanic for Greyhound buses, and he got to see one of this motors work, and he was trying to convince Greyhound to start putting them in their buses. Like, we could run our buses on this cold fusion engine and not have to buy any fuel anymore and make a killing. And anyway, that didn't really go through, but they were working on trying to make that happen. They were trying to get a Greyhound demo bus with one of his motors in it. He was served a restraining order from the Department of Energy. It's not the Department of Education, it's the Department of Energy, which prohibited him from producing more of his motors. And then before he died, he left his Illinois workshop in the middle of the night and moved everything he had to California, because apparently he was being threatened and whatever. And he just decided, oh, I'm out of here. So he ends up in California, and then he dies unexpectedly of a heart attack when he was in perfectly good health. So back to the heart attack gun. Who knows? Like, you can't prove it, but you can't prove it didn't happen either. So there's this guy, Richard Clem, is also in the 70s. He created a vegetable oil powered engine. And he said, and so this engine, supposedly it was a closed system. It contained 8 gallons of vegetable oil inside of the engine. It seems like that was just kind of how it got started, how it was lubricated, and then it would kind of self-sustain and it would keep running. So he said that with 8 gallons of vegetable oil, you could run an engine for 150,000 miles, his engine. He put the engine in a Ford Falcon, and Ford threatened to sue him for using his engine in their car. And so he like modified the body so that they couldn't sue him for having it in a Ford Falcon, I guess. And then he didn't get sued, but that they had threatened him. He apparently sold his design. He tried to sell it to a lot of different automobile companies. And for whatever reason, if they didn't believe him, or they didn't, they didn't see it as a profitable enterprise, he was unable to sell it. And then he finally sold it to a large coal company. It doesn't say what company. I wasn't able to track down the name of a company, but he sold it to a coal company, apparently, saying they were going to power turbines with it. And then he died of a heart attack, and all of his stuff was confiscated from his lab, just like everybody else. Edwin Gray was another guy in the 70s. He developed an engine that recharged its battery, basically, so that it never ran out of power. It operated from pulse capacitance discharge, which is basically like how a Tesla coil works. It's a capacitor stores energy, stores electricity. So an oscillating circuit consists of an inductor and a condenser, or a capacitor. So the inductor is the coil that creates an electric charge from a magnetic field, and then the conductor, or the capacitor, stores the energy until it can be released all at once. So pulse capacitance discharge just means that you have something that's storing up energy and then releasing a shock, so it's pulsed. That's why it's pulsed, because it's releasing a shock as it builds up and then releases and builds up and releases. So the energy he was creating was supposedly cold electricity, which you can research all about that if you want to. It has to do with negative versus positive energy, and I don't know, it's complicated, but yeah, he died mysteriously at home in his trailer where he lived with his girlfriend, but she happened to not be home that night for some reason. I don't know. Stan Meyer, a lot of people might have heard of. He toured around in the 90s, toured around the US in his little dune buggy. You can see here, water-powered car, it says on the side. Um, and he was using electrolysis to be able to break apart the water molecules and run his car on hydrogen. And he died from meeting with some investors at a restaurant. I think his brother was there with him. And he started to eat lunch, and then he ran out of the restaurant clutching his throat, fell to the ground, and his last words to his brother were, "They poisoned me." Denny Klein, another guy who split the water molecule, he called the gas aquagen that he was creating from splitting the water molecule. He received a patent actually for his. He installed his system in a Ford Escort, but it did still use gasoline. The hydrogen he was creating was a supplementary fuel. So it was basically a hybrid that was still using gasoline, but it was much more fuel efficient with the electrolysis device he put in it. And he had actually testified before Congress, and he was supposedly working with the military to set up some Hummers with his system that he had created. I don't know about how he died. I didn't get any information about that. It's a little, I think he died of natural causes, which, like, who knows? So yeah, that's a lot of different guys that worked on fuel efficiency, carburetors, hydrolysis, electrolysis, powered cars, water powered cars. It's a real thing. It's been covered up multiple times. We all should be just driving around on water powered cars right now that are totally clean. They don't make exhaust that pollutes our environment. But obviously, the oil companies make way too much money for us to be running our cars on water. We need all that water for the big AI data centers, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And, I think one of the big lessons from all of this, and I think Agent had detailed this in his article about the Garabed, but never, ever, ever, if you're an inventor, bring it to the patent office, because that's your guarantee that it's going to be locked away somewhere or perhaps used by military clandestine
Yeah.
forces, but it will never see the light of day. And I think it might have been the inventor of the Garabed who had resisted ever having it patented, that he just knew he had seen others go down that path and have bad things happen. So I think that's the first lesson. But I think even beyond that, just the concept of petroleum being a limited resource is also a big psyop. I fully believe that there's abundance in that underneath the so-called Earth's crust, and that there's just large pools of it everywhere. But of course, part of the psyop was saying that it was fossil fuel from the dinosaurs, and Jake's got a few funny ones behind him there that supposedly all this came from. But that being said, I mean, I don't think we need petroleum as a fuel source to begin with. But if we were stuck with that, there's just so much of it. There's no reason it should ever be expensive. But that's just one more example of manipulation of markets to keep the people who are powerful and rich, and the rest of us kind of under their thumb. Jake, what other thoughts do you
And
have
a lot
there?
of it is like, even those guys who created really efficient carburetors, they're still running their cars on petroleum, but they were able to increase their gas mileage by 10x, whatever, or something. And, so obviously that's not acceptable. But yeah. Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, I think everything just points to abundance versus scarcity and control, and the paradigm that we're put under, that we're brought under as soon as we're born, is the scarcity paradigm and zero-sum game in society, and we're just born into it. You got to fight. This is the way it is, and it's just it's obviously not working super well, except for a certain segment that controls that paradigm. So just we've touched on abundance a lot, and I appreciate that PJ mentioned that oil is most likely abiotic, which means self-perpetuating. It just appears itself, it regenerates. And if you've ever seen the testimonies of people that had little oil production in their kind of backyard oil production in places like the Oklahoma plains or Texas. They capped them. They literally put a cement cap over it, and then a few years later, it's gushing again. Go explain that if it's a scarce resource and a finite resource. But I don't really have any further questions as far as your presentation has gone. It's very eye-opening to see each sector that is a part of this control system.
Yeah. So the last section, there's just a few guys to talk about, and I'm not going to go too into depth on it, but cold fusion is a thing, it's kind of sci-fi. We think of it as like far out, and, obviously we know that at least since the 40s, since World War II, we've had the capability to create fission bombs, and we've created these massive, Simpsons style nuclear plants that end up in these disasters like Fukushima and Chernobyl or whatever, right? Um, and but that's fission, which fission means to combine two atoms together. Oh, I'm sorry. Fission is to break atoms apart. Fusion is to combine atoms together, and fusion is basically what happens in the sun. Right? I mean, in stars, if you believe in such things. But anyway, so the whole focus of fusion, really, for the most part, for the last 75 years or whatever, has been how do we create a small little sun that we can control in our lab and somehow control this thing that we're creating, this thing that makes a lot of energy, but it's so incredibly hot it melts whatever we try to put it in, right? And so anyway, these guys in University of Utah in 1989 came out. They didn't go through a peer review process. They just held a press conference to the public on the news, and they said, we have found that in our lab on the bench, we've created excess energy from fusion without any heat, with that, at least, at room temperature or whatever. They may have produced some heat. I don't know the exact details, but basically they're putting palladium rods in deuterium, which is heavy water. Like I said, it's hydrogen with an extra proton in it. And the palladium rods, the deuterium goes into the palladium, it creates a reaction, and it creates heat and energy. One thing I'd like to say about nuclear energy is most of the nuclear energy that we use, that we've had for a long time, all they're doing with it is boiling water. It's not a direct energy conversion where like some of these, 0 point energy and etheric energy devices that are using electromagnetic means to create energy out of the ether. It's it's not creating direct energy conversion. It's making heat, which the heat is used to boil water and turn a turbine, just like the same way that we've done for a couple hundred years, right?
Just like burning coal.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing. So anyway, Fleischmann and Pons were the guys from University of Utah that came out in 1989 and said that they had produced cold fusion in their lab. This was very controversial, and their experiments were replicated all over the place by people in all different countries. And some of them claimed, yeah, we found excess heat, and a lot of them claimed, no, we didn't. It's hard to say who's lying and who's telling the truth, or most likely some people were successful and some weren't. And so basically, if anybody wasn't successful, they were going to say, oh yeah, see, it doesn't work, right? So where am I? So cold fusion. So then there's this guy, Eugene Malov. He was at MIT. He defended Pons and Fleischmann, and he wrote a whole book about the whole incident with them, called Fire from Ice. And I started to read it, but I haven't actually read the whole book. He resigned from MIT because they were hiding cold fusion data. So he walked away from his academic career, and he wrote this book, Fire from Ice, and he started this magazine called Infinite Energy, which I thought it had gone out of business last year, and maybe it did. Maybe it's done now, but it was still publishing articles up until last year, and you could get it online. You can get back issues online and stuff. So he was going to have a press conference where he was going to share a free energy device in 2004. And then he ended up being beaten to death in a rental home that he owned, which was a house he grew up in. This was the day before he was supposed to have his press conference about his free energy device. He ended up beaten to death in his rental property. There's a guy named Dmitry Petronov, which was Russian. He supposedly, it's hard to find information on Russian guys, because you got to find stuff that's been translated. But so this guy supposedly powered his house for like 14 months or something on a plasma battery that he had created. And then in 2009, he had some Americans come to visit him saying they were interested in his battery and wanted to invest in having it manufactured. And one of these guys ended up being like a guy who worked with NASA and DARPA. His name was Zach Warfield. So the guy Petronov disappeared and his battery was confiscated by the Russian government. And then the Zach Warfield guy, who you would think is the guy who's behind the whole thing, he ended up dying a year later too. He was knocked off as well in a boating accident. So that whole situation got brushed under the rug, swept under the rug, and nobody has his battery that he created. There's another guy that it's hard to get real detailed information about, but I put his middle name in here because there's another. If you look up Ari Degius, you're gonna get some like it's the name of a guy who was in charge at like Shell Oil or something. He's like a big oil guy, a big yeah, and he did a bunch of things and wrote a book. And so if you look up the name Ari Degius, you get that guy. And this guy did something that actually undermined the oil, the oil companies. He actually created some kind of energy generator that he was on his way to Europe to talk with investors that wanted to buy his technology, and he was found dead in his car at the airport from coronary or from cardiac event, from a heart attack, basically. So another heart attack victim, and this was in 2007 that this guy died. And then, so that's basically what I got. I could probably talk about more people, but I just tried to keep it limited. So I don't know if you guys might have heard about this or not, but there's another MIT guy following in the footsteps of Eugene Malov. This guy, Nuno Loureiro, was the head of plasma physics at MIT, and basically was working on nuclear fusion at MIT. They've got one of the largest like plasma physics labs in the country there, I guess. MIT's got their finger in everything, but or at least all the shady stuff. But anyway, so this guy he was the head of the department at MIT of plasma physics, and he was just murdered in his home like a few weeks ago. And then curiously, within a week, like days after that, the Trump Media Group comes out, who's the owners of Truth Social. Like that's basically all they own, and the stock is tanking, right? It's like, who even uses Truth Social? I don't know. Maybe people, obviously somebody's using it, but anyway, it's not making much money. And so they went out and they bought this company called Tri-Alpha Energy, which is one of only a couple really kind of possible breakthrough fusion technology companies that's doing plasma physics, fusion technology. So that's owned now by Trump's family, by his media group, and they're expected to be releasing like working prototypes in the next, probably by 2030, I'm sure. But anyway, fusion is on the horizon. The thing is that it would be possible for us to create a decentralized system where we could all have small fusion generators in our home or in our neighborhood or whatever, and produce a lot of small scale energy. But they're going to keep it as obviously another like uh, centralized production facility where, you're still paying your meter, you're still paying to get your energy from instead of like a coal burning generator at the power plant, they're going to have a fusion generator at the power plant. It's going to cost them less, but are they going to charge us any less for our energy? Probably not. So there's that. That's the fusion wrap up. And then there's a guy named Malcolm Bindle, which if nobody's heard of him, he's worth looking into. He hasn't been knocked off yet. And he's going commercial with this thing he's created called the thunderstorm generator, which again is like an electrolysis, basically splitting water. And it works off of like a double vortex, two opposing vortexes, and it increases the efficiency of any engine they hook it up to, and it creates almost zero like carbon monoxide and toxic waste from the exhaust and everything. So the thunderstorm generator is very interesting. And then there's a guy named Eric Dollard who's done a lot of research on Tesla. He's an experimenter that grew up around what is it? Bell? No, I'm trying to think. Anyway, he's a really like genius guy who's an electrical engineer guy. And he
Maybe
has been
Livermore
working.
Labs.
No, it was I'm trying to think. I don't know. I forget what his history was now, but anyway, he's an interesting guy.
worries.
But he's working on some basically like Tesla's communications tech, which sends, instead of sending radio waves through the air, it sends vibrations through the earth, and it uses the earth. That's what telluric mean. Did I say that right? Telluric. Rather than aerial or etheric, it's telluric. It's sending vibrations through the earth, and that's how there's it's like radio, but going through solid instead of through air. So that's kind of an interesting thing that's going on too. And then one last slide is just if people are interested, I've got a few places you can go look, and you can see a lot of what I used to research this. So Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project is set up when the guy Fleischmann was half of Fleischmann and Pons from Utah, who created cold fusion in 1989, supposedly. This guy, Bob Greenier, is just really, really smart, and he gives great presentations, and you can find him on Substack. Usually it's under MFMP on YouTube or on Substack or whatever. I think that's what you'll find it under for Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. Bob Greenier, he's a real smart guy, and he talks about a lot of this tech. Mostly more like the fusion kind of stuff and plasma kind of stuff. But Tesla Universe is a good website with there's a couple of Tesla websites that have a ton of, you can find information on Tesla and all of his patents and all of his inventions. Rex Research is a good one that just goes over all these different technologies and has articles about each of these inventors where they bring up all the old newspaper articles showing their presentation or their introductions of their inventions to the public and stuff. Stealthskater.com is kind of a weird one, but it's just a conglomeration of a bunch of interesting things related to some of it's more like space travel and sci-fi type stuff, real like sci-fi futuristic technology, but a lot of it is also just this kind of free energy stuff and medical devices and medical technologies that have been suppressed and stuff. Infiniteenergy.com, which one is that? That is infiniteenergy.com. Oh, that's the magazine that Eugene Malov produced, and you can look at some articles on there, and you can also order back issues of his magazine that's mostly about fusion, but it's a lot about 0 point energy and different types of free energy technologies and stuff. So that's pretty much it.
Well, first of all, thank you for putting that together. That was a great presentation, and I think it's a really nice intro for people who aren't as versed as you in this suppressed tech world, and I think that there's a lot there to build upon. Obviously, you never touched the medical tech, for example, and you gave some really great resources. So I'm sure there's more we could sometime in the future we could have a part 3 on this and go deeper into some of the other realms and revisit
Yeah.
some of the stuff that Agent has been chronicling. But what a great introduction for any of our listeners to just really have all these resources and look into it themselves and question why aren't we using these things today? Why are we still using such backwards and inefficient technologies? And I think the answer is apparent as you put the pieces together. So I'll just say thanks again for putting this together and guiding our listeners to all these great resources and stories of people who've tried to get it out there, and the system was set up for them to fail. So those are my parting thoughts. Jake, what would you also part with here?
Yeah, just thanking Brady once again for all the hard work that he put into putting this together. And really, it just raises more questions, like not just what happened with these individual cases, but bigger picture things like what is the nature of energy? Where does it come from? How do we regain, or maybe we like to use the word like co-creation. How do we co-create with it? And I'll just mention one little thing, which is I was listening to a mind-blowing podcast by the Occult Rejects recently, and their guest raised an example of somebody that was doing an experiment with light. The light essentially created matter, right? And so I think a lot of this might come down to plasma and light, and it's biblical in a way, right? If you don't have matter, then let there be light, and then everything follows from that, and including the way everything vibrates together. So yeah, maybe we just need to look at the big picture sometimes and we'll find some answers. Yeah, but
well,
couldn't thank you anymore. This is great.
basically, there's a lot of controversy over whether Einstein was right or wrong, and we all know he married his cousins and all this stuff, right? So, and it's been said that he didn't really have any original ideas, and he just, what do you call it when you copy somebody else's work? What's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, plagiarized a lot of what, yeah, right. So, but regardless of whether it was him or somebody else, the whole idea of relativity is that energy converts to matter and matter converts to energy. And I think that's true regardless of whether everything, regardless of it exactly works how he says or if his formulas are correct or not. But E equals MC squared is just basically saying, if you get energy dense enough, it's going to become matter, and if you get matter like spun up enough, it's just going to dissolve into energy. And so I think that I think that's undeniably true. I mean, that's my belief. I can't prove it to you right now with some formulas or something, but I think that that's true. And there's energy all around us, and people have figured out how to tap into it. And I mean, just start looking at like, how do magnets work? How do gyroscopes work? Like, why is there gravity? Things like that, those are the things that just fascinate me. And then I end up going down these rabbit holes of science where it's like you get into trying to learn about some of this stuff, and you start looking at these theoretic theoretical mathematicians that have come up with all these formulas. Oh yeah, this proves this or that. It's like, that just doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know how to read this, like I'm not trained for this, but I can understand a lot of the concepts, at least on a basic level. And yeah, I mean, if you can understand the right way to set up that magnetic flux where you can harvest it, it, you know, magnets just work. Permanent magnets are a crazy thing. We've seen them since we were a little kid. And it's like, why does that thing stick to the refrigerator? Is that any different than why I stick to the earth instead of floating away? Like, there's something else. If I put something plastic on my refrigerator, it's just going to fall on the ground. But I put a magnet on there and boom, it's stuck. And it's like, that is a powerful force. And that's kind of the basis of electricity and everything else, is that magnets create the electricity. The movement of magnetic forces creates electricity, and the magnetism seems to come down to basically like a vortex. It's like it's a spinning motion, and that spinning creates a force. And whether it's I mean, yeah, it's just it's like aligned rotation. When things all spin together in the same direction and the same speed, then it creates a force. Anyway, I could ramble about a lot of stuff, but if you guys are interested, we could do this again sometime. Maybe talk about some of the medical stuff or whatever. But I just think the energy production stuff is really like, it just really slaps you in the face. It's so obvious that, oh, all these guys that created these things like had their labs raided, had their inventions destroyed. They died mysteriously of heart attacks when they were healthy. And, and the oil cartels are still just making billions off of all of us driving our stupid little cars around, you know? So
So
it's kind of
true. So
undeniable.
yeah, totally agreed. And yeah, let's talk about a part three sometime in the future. But like I said, this has been a great introduction to all the suppressed tech, and you've done a great job of summarizing. So keep
Right
doing
on.
that. Maybe think about creating a Substack. Maybe think about
Yeah.
putting something on the Shadowban library. I think the more this gets out, the better.
I have been thinking about starting up a Substack. I was gonna maybe do it. I started to write a first post kind of talking about me and the things I wanted to discuss. And then I'm a little discouraged by hearing about, how Substack's kind of go in the way of a lot of the other. Substack's been really touted as one of the best social media platforms for sharing ideas and not having too much censorship. And it seems to be going the way of everybody's going to have to give a digital face ID and all this, and I think they're going to just chase away their customer base. They're going to destroy their own model if they do that. But anyway, I might throw it on there anyway, and maybe I'll just try to link up with Agent and get on Agent and Medicine Girls new platform when they get it going. I'd love to support that. So we'll see.
Well, great. I love all that, and I'll just say we'll reach out sometime in 2026 and talk about that future
Mm.
episode, and just keep documenting everything you're learning. I think it's great for that awareness to raise for everyone. So thanks again for
Yeah.
joining, and to our listeners, we've got a lot more planned for this month and beyond. So stay tuned.
Thanks so much, you guys.